any face-to-face classroom, there are always periods like this. It's just, we just notice it so much more when we're on Zoom.
Well, I think you might have to play the show and then share the page.
That's good.
Oh, there we go. Beautiful. Okay. Morning, evening, afternoon, everybody. Got some noise. It's super wonderful to be here. We're really excited about it. We're really appreciative to be able to speak to you in this format, which is always super exciting. As Carl mentioned, this little cluster group is ostensibly LCTQ for LCT Queensland. We're all here at the University of Queensland in a conference room at the business school, which is a great place for us to be back again. It's somewhere that we would normally meet. You can see it in the photo there, and you can see the scribbles that normally happen on the whiteboard behind me. And this group really came together as a little working group for us to share our interests and kind of experiments with LCT and SFL as well. We also have an SFL contingent attached to this now as well. And so what we're going to talk about today is really something that came out of our, organically out of our collaboration over the last couple of years. And it's completely formative at this stage. We're really presenting something that is kind of an interesting project to us that it has kind of been bubbling up of its own accord. So yeah, this is a theoretical work for the moment and completely formative. So there were some ideas discussed about half an hour before this. Things may change during the course of the presentation, and we're very excited about it. So today's presentation, as you might have guessed, is about, well, as you all know from the roundtable blurb, is all about authentic assessment. And more specifically, we're interested in one aspect of authentic assessment, which is realism. And that's kind of the point there of that little cartoon, which gets at that distinction between test taking on the one hand and the capability to take tests, and the HR manager of the hypothetical graduate on the other hand, who is curious about the real world skills that that graduate might have. So that's the context for this presentation. Before we get too into the authentic assessment and realism component though, I'm going to provide a little bit of context, and then after I've done that, Ken is going to dive into some autonomy stuff, and then Andrew is going to touch on semantics. And if our brains haven't imploded by the end of that, we will talk about what it all might mean afterwards. So just to situate things for you, the way that we are contriving of authentic assessment at the moment, and it really is at the moment, is in terms of this broader assessment context. And we've come to think about assessment in terms of these two kind of heuristic constellations, which is what you can see here on the screen. And this isn't a formal analysis as such. This is really part of our conceptual experiment, as it were. Those of you who have done any work in assessment might be familiar with the terminology assessment for learning, which has been and increasingly is contrasted against this idea of assessment of learning, which is sort of similar to the idea of formative assessment as contrasted against summative assessment. But in this case, we're using that terminology to describe collections of stances, if you like. And so we've got this learning-oriented kind of constellation on the left, a paradigm, sometimes we call it. And you'll see authentic assessment sits in there. And then on the right, you can see the assessment of learning constellation, which is significantly more measurement oriented. And the resources that we've been leveraging in putting together this framework are really the literature on assessment. And there's a couple of references there at the bottom, and they'll be available to you at the end if you're interested to follow up on any of these on any of these comparisons that are sitting in this table. But the main point here is that the assessment of learning paradigm is generally concerned with supporting validity and reliability in assessment practices in the traditional sense. Often there's an interest in edging towards more objective means of testing of students' capabilities, whereas the assessment for learning paradigm tends to be more focused on the learning that's taking place and the roles of the social roles of the students and their teacher counterparts in learning interactions. So that's the broad context. Drilling in a little further, this is for us situated, our interest in authentic assessment is situated, I think, in what we've come to think of as a kind of politicization of the idea of authentic. Just quickly, a historical note about authentic assessment. It has its origins, it's popularly recognized to have its origins in the late 80s, in the sense that the terminology came out in the literature. 1988, I think, is often recognized as the first authentic assessment year. And it has its origins in that respect in very much in the American pre-tertiary schooling sector, where there was a cultural push away from standardized testing, multiple choice testing mainly, towards a more holistic, substantial testing of authentic, what came to be called authentic skills. And in the late 80s, early 90s, the focus appears to have been mainly on skills in the sense of generic transferable skills. So problem solving, self-reflection, things like this, which were held to be more applicable and better represent in an assessment context what students would be faced with in the workplace. Today, I think we're comfortable with the deduction that authenticity has been applied as well as to the skills side of things to the task side of things as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about task design as we go on, and that'll become a more important theme in this presentation. But it's certainly an additional layer that's been added is this focus on how authentically a task represents the kind of task a student would face in the real world. And so the real world orientation is a big part of this, of the way we're interpreting authenticity here. And it's important to note that it's certainly not the only interpretation of authenticity in the context of authentic assessment. Other interpretations sometimes focus on, say, the psychological aspect, the authenticity to self in an assessment context, and we're not going there in this presentation. We're focused primarily on authenticity with the real world and real world tasks as the point of comparison.
Can I just jump in for a second?
Sure.
Because I forgot to tell everybody that they can jump in at any moment, by the way. So if people do want to just come in and say something and add a comment, and I'm sure that you're keen to get some feedback as you go on and lay out what you're doing, particularly as a conceptual stage. So I'm using this as an opportunity to do what I should have done earlier on. But I just wanted to say that's really interesting, that definition, because I once was at an education research conference in which somebody described themselves as having done authentic tasks, and the authentic task was that the students had to be an FBI agent investigating an alien abduction. I just thought maybe this person had watched too many episodes of the X-Files, because that wasn't quite what I thought authentic assessment was. But yeah, so I can see that what you mean about there being kind of a bit of a loose definition sometimes by some people, but you're focused on the real world orientation.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. But it's also, I mean, sort of tangential to your point. It's interesting that that you mentioned that kind of example, because even with and I mean, this is kind of the point of our work and our interest in this, even with the real world as the point of focus, it's still a difficult concept to get inside of, because in different disciplines that can look quite different. Music, which is my discipline, has very real world looking kinds of assessment tasks already baked into most curricula at a higher education level, and it's had a long tradition of doing that. And so for me and for academics in music coming to, say, the discourse on authentic assessment, it's a different, the terms of engagement are different, say, to somebody coming from another discipline that perhaps has less of an obviously practical focus. What I think is worth noting in relation to that discourse of coming to authentic assessment is what that third point on the slide there articulates, which is that authentic assessment conceptually has been absorbed into this assessment for learning paradigm that we outlined previously, and in some cases quite explicitly in the literature. And we're going to talk about a literature review that was conducted in 2017 in a moment that does that very thing of explicitly linking authentic assessment to assessment for learning. And this is important to us because the character of authenticity is clearly becoming a basis for the legitimacy of assessment and the legitimation of assessment designs, and perhaps even for, in the assessment community, for the legitimation of certain perspectives that one might hold as an expert or not in assessment. So our interest in authentic assessment is really couched, particularly in this last point, where we're concerned about being able to act in a context where authenticity is politicized. And in grappling with this problem, we quickly realized, I think, you guys feel free to add to this if you want to. We quickly realized that our kind of ground level concern with authentic assessment is that it's kind of oxymoronic. Authentic assessment is sort of impossible in one sense when you think about it, because a task that you will undertake or set for a student in an authentic assessment context is by definition not the same thing as what that student or what a person will do in a similar real world context. It can look very, very similar, but the ingredients of the actual practice are always fundamentally different because the situation is just not the same. And in seeking to think about how we would, we knew by this point that we wanted to use LCT to make sense of authentic assessment. And so we spent some time thinking about our high level kind of standpoint on it and what our entry point was to thinking about it. And so we arrived at this idea of a kind of a bifocal set of positions for interpreting authenticity. On the one hand, we have what we're calling the ontological interpretation, where the concern is very much with the, was that a question from somebody? Oh, just a sound. The concern is very much with the substance of authenticity and whether that is present or not. And our sense is that from an ontological standpoint, or a standpoint that privileges an ontological interpretation of authenticity, it's very much about whether or not an assessment task might be authentic. And we're contrasting this with a view of assessment in terms of its degrees of resemblance to social practice. And we're calling this the pedagogic interpretation, I think because we suspect this might be more useful for addressing students' learning in an educational context. And so the concern here is less with the substance of authenticity and either or, as far as the authenticity is present in an assessment task or not. rather it's about authenticity by degrees of resemblance to social practice. So our concern here is not so much with kind of the ontological question, because we suspect that's sort of a what do you call it?
Not to mention it's self-defeating because it is always already an educational context.
Yeah, exactly. And so instead of taking that approach, we're interested in how what we do in the educational context bears resemblance to what happens in the social practice that we might be preparing students to engage with.
Can I just jump in here with something that I thought, and I've also seen that Steve Kirk has written in the chat. Steve, you can jump in and speak at any time, as can everybody, which is like, are you making a distinction here? It sounds a little bit like the kind of, one's more like the content, you know, kind of fairly surface level content. It's like, you know, it looks like it, it seems like it, it's in a particular, it's doing particular things, or it's in a particular space. And as Ken quite rightly said, you know, actually in those terms, no, I don't think any assessment in or task inside education is authentic in that sense, because it is pedagogized already. And so all the practices have been recontextualized. And so you're, am I right in thinking, this is a comment also from Steve, is that it's more like you're looking at, when you say pedagogic, you kind of mean trying to get at the underlying principles. So even though it may be pedagogized, the underlying principles may match those of the real world task out there.
I think that's fair to say.
So we are really unpacking the notion of authenticity in terms of how we are socializing these students into the social practices.
Into the codes, effectively.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. You're very effectively preempting
Excellent.
where we're going, I think. Okay. So that's the broad framing. Since the late 80s, there has been in the assessment literature and amongst the scholarly community of assessment interested people, a fair bit of work done on authentic assessment conceptually. And one of the major milestones in that body of work is this paper. You can see the reference there on the slide, which is a systematic review conducted of the authentic assessment literature in 2017. And so the authors listed here collected 127 pieces of literature and analyzed them with the intention of essentially decoding what it is that we're talking about, what it is we mean when we talk about authentic assessment. And they arrived at this group of 3 dimensions, which you can see here on the screen, which they argued were, according to their analysis, present in just about every theoretical formulation of the concept of authenticity in authentic assessment. And as I said at the start, our focus is very much on the realism side of things here. We haven't really gone into cognitive challenge or evaluative judgment. And that's really, I think, also probably to do with scope and circumstance and the way that this work kind of has emerged of its own natural accord. I think we find realism to be a rich starting point for working with LCT in this sense. So to give you a sense of where we're starting from in terms of addressing realism in the way that these authors you can see here analyzed the concept in their review, I'm going to read you just a little bit of the original paper, of the review. And this is the last slide from me, after which I'm going to hand over to Ken, who's going to go into the autonomy side of things. But this will give you a feel for where we started, and maybe it'll give you a bit of a clue as to how what kind of initial threads we saw in getting at the concept of realism. So the authors tell us in the study that realism can come in 2 forms. On the one hand, the presence of a real context that describes and delivers a frame for the problem to be solved, or on the other hand, a task to be solved that is similar to what is faced in real and or professional life. And they go on to say that in authentic assessment, the context is realistic when information about the described situation problem comes from real and or professional life, involving pertinent and relevant questions to solve applicable to realistic situations. This transfer being possible when ideas relate to facts and skills to experience, applying previous knowledge to new situations and tasks. This realistic context can be present in examinations and written tasks when items are prepared, such as case analyses, problem solving, and short or extensive essay questions, which act as a proxy of the real world. So this is what we've already been talking about a little bit. And this was, you know, it was, I think, right for the analyzing, which is why we went for it. Finally, the authors tell us that the second way to create realism is through performance-based tasks, where students produce work or demonstrate knowledge, understanding, and skills in activities that are close to the profession. Wiggins and McTighe designated as authentic assessment requirements that demand a true representation of performance in that field of employment in question. Teachers must know what are the typical tasks and functions that employment demands, and design assessments that are authentic simulations of real professional tasks. And that's why we took the title of this presentation, Authentic Simulations. So with that, I'm going to hand on to Ken, and it's all going to make a little bit more sense, hopefully, as we dig into the autonomy side of things.
Thanks. So as Jack has mentioned earlier about authentic simulations referring to resemblances, the first question I think we can ask analytically is, what exactly is it supposed to resemble? And I think that this is one area that we can make use of Lct autonomy to explore a little further. So on the one hand, I'll be talking about how positional autonomy is a useful concept for looking at workplace resemblances, how the practice of the assessment resembles constituents from the workplace. I'll introduce relational autonomy as a way to look at workplace-specific tasks. So how do the tasks resemble the workplace? And finally, I'll be going through a little bit on the implications of applying autonomy to authentic assessment design. So I'm taking the definition of positional autonomy from Maton and Howard 2018 here, defining it as the relative degree of insulation between constituents' position within a category and those positioned in other contexts or categories. So if we think about what do these authentic assessment scholars think about when they are thinking about, you know, constituents of authentic constituents of the workplace, they are probably thinking about work roles, work concepts, and work artifacts. So I won't go into great detail in the how we characterize the distinction between these three aspects. I think that is better left to other dimensions of LCT. But as far as our positional autonomy analysis is concerned, we are looking at all of these three aspects. So by work roles, we are referring to roles that are ascribed to specific members of the workplace. In this case, for example, a manager, an accountant, a marketing team, and so on. Notice that here we are also looking at different degrees of generality and specificity. So for example, it can apply to a specific person, such as a manager. It could be a profession, such as an accountant, or it can apply equally to a group of people, a collection of people, such as a team. So for example, that can be contrasted against, say, academic roles of having a lecturer, a tutorial group, or a student, right, which is generally considered as inauthentic. We can have work concepts such as account payables, advertising, and so on. In a sense, when you're looking at work concepts within the workplace, they generally describe or characterize organizational functions. So for example, account payables would be a particular wing within the organization that deals with a specific set of accounts. Equally, advertising is a function of a business, right? to get a sense of what I mean by work concepts, we can contrast them against what we can think of as academic concepts, such as strategic accounting or principles of marketing. Now, these are, of course, theories, but interestingly, nobody really talks about the theory of strategic accounting when you're at the workplace, an accounting workplace. Finally, we have work artifacts, and work artifacts can range from the more abstract to the more concrete. For example, it can be something that's physically right in front of you, such as a work desk, but it can equally refer to an electronic system that's online, such as an accounting system. We can be referring to a budget or resume. Now, for those of you guys who sense, especially in SFL, who sense that there can be something a bit more to say about the budget and resume, that generally falls into the class of semiotic objects that I have explored with Andrew previously. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But here I'm contrasting these as work artifacts as opposed to, say, academic artifacts as examples. You have the classroom, which is the physical thing. You can have Turnitin and the MOOC, which are softwares, essentially, and as opposed to a budget or resume, you can have, say, an assignment or an exam. Okay. Now, so with this in mind, the next thing I'd like to do in this analysis is to adopt the perspective of the authentic assessment scholars, okay? So in that sense, I'm going to do something quite different from what you guys would usually do, in the sense that I'm placing workplace as our target. Okay, this is not to say that there's anything essential about that, but we choose that as a target in order to understand the viewpoint of the authentic assessment scholars. Just to clarify that point. So with that, we can then assign PA plus to the workplace or industry, and PA minus to anything that is non-industry. And in this case, we have discussed this amongst ourselves as well, and we're wondering whether it must necessarily be academic, as we have suggested in that list above. Well, for all you know, we can be referring to janitorial work, which is not necessarily, you know, one way or the other. But for the purpose of our analysis, PA minus tends to be academic simply because of our focus on formal assessments. It's just difficult for us to think of items that are formal assessments, which are neither industry-oriented nor academic-oriented, purely for that purpose. So for that, with that, we can then say, for example, place on one end industry stuff or industry data that's taken from a business as PA plus or double plus. We can have academic stuff or academic, you know, exams, assignments right at the other end. But putting that on a continuum like this allows us to explore the in-betweens. For example, as opposed to having a purely academic exam or industry data, you can have hypothetical or documented scenarios. For example, you can be talking about a case that has actually happened in the past in history that they are drawing some of the data from, but neither the staff nor the students are directly involved in this historical case.
Ken, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So I'm wondering, just wondering if you're working as a lecturer, would there be an overlap between work roles and academic roles and work artifacts and academic artifacts, but not necessarily the concepts? Just thinking about it, because it seems like we, you know, as a lecturer, a lot of this, oh, sorry, it's early, guys. A lot of we're always being looked at from the institution and, you know, evaluated all the time. So yeah, assessed. So I'm just wondering if that might be useful for me to think about it in those terms as well. What do you think?
Yep, definitely. So the line below is deliberately quoted from Maton and Howard, where they mention about PA or constituents involving actors, ideas, artifacts, and institutions. So here we are deliberately saying that it could be a combination of these things where, you know, PA plus or minus could be attributed to any of these things in combination and can be compared in that way. So firstly, that takes out some of the dilemma when we are doing an analysis. Also, at the same time, as you were rightly suggesting there, you can actually talk about how you can have certain types of PA plus as opposed to other types of PA plus.
Thank you.
Thanks. And of course, the other thing is we can further explore roles, concepts, and artifacts in terms of other dimensions of LCT equally, which Andrew will be doing in a moment under semantics.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks. We have found that it's often necessary to bring in multiple dimensions when we are doing our analysis in order to adequately account for what is happening there. So,
Tann, can I just ask something very?
Yes.
Can I just ask something very quickly, which is in my university, they're increasingly shifting all students to do group projects that are supposedly somehow related to the real world, and I have a feeling they're going to increasingly bring in private companies that have no educational basis, but they are consultants. They've already done it for the teams that run these project units. So the next stage will probably be to privatize the actual provision of the teaching as well. And they would be non-academic staff, but they wouldn't be industry either. So they would also be something that perhaps might appear in terms of the people in your PA minus, because they're certainly not, because the thing about the autonomy and targets is that non-target is a bit of a kind of miscellaneous, everything else, you know, PA minus, RA minus is always everything else. So they would probably also be like your academic staff. They would be, you know, PA minus, they'd be something from outside the target. It doesn't always matter whether it's near or further away. They might actually be parallel distanced, but I was just thinking of another example, because you were saying you were struggling to think of anything beyond industry and academic, but there might be increasingly consultant type people brought in to do stupid assessment tasks that they've thought up and got off the internet, if you know what I mean.
Although they probably wouldn't want to be categorized as such, PA minus.
Well, they certainly would not be part of the target industry. They would be educational experts, but they wouldn't be academics as such, but they would definitely be outside the target.
Thanks for that, Carl. That's very helpful. So in terms of resemblances in PA, then we have to ask, does it involve workplace or academic actors, ideas, artifacts, and so on, or other kinds of non-industry data, roles, concepts, and artifacts, as Carl has pointed out there. So just in case you're wondering if all of that is considered as PA, then what exactly is RA? Well, then again, referring back to Maton and Howard's definition of RA, in terms of relative degree of insulation between relations among constituents or category and relations among constituents of other contexts or categories. So in this case, they pointed out the suggested purposes, aims, ways of working, and so on. I would like to explore this a little bit further, partly from the SFL background that I'm from. And we'll like to divide that into three possibilities, where we have work relationships, work activities, and work communication. Let me explain what is going on here. So work relationships in this case refers to the relations between constituents as opposed to the identity of the constituent itself. What I mean by that is, if you compare that to the list that we had earlier regarding work roles, you have manager, for example, or accountant. Now you can imagine someone with a name tag or a label on the table or the door that says manager or accountant, but you're not likely to find a name tag that says supervisor, co-worker, or internal customer. Okay. So in that sense, from an SFL point of view, these really refer broadly to the notion of tenor relationships, as opposed to identity of the constituent. So if we were to contrast that against what we consider to be not a work relationship, for example, the assessor and SSC, a candidate, full-time enrollment, as opposed to part-time enrollment and so on. Different ways that staff members can relate to the student. As opposed to that, we can have work activities. This will be my interpretation of Maton and Howard's suggestion about purposes and ways of working. In this case, we can have, say, the month-end consolidation or year-end consolidation of the accounts, a board meeting, staff training, and so on. These, those of you who are in SFL would broadly recognize these to be genres or practices. Then we can have, we can contrast that against, for example, the curriculum, a tutorial, an examination, as opposed to what we mentioned earlier about the exam being an artifact. Here we have an examination as a process or an activity. Again, similarly, in terms of work communication, we have business proposals, financial reports, and so on, sales proposal and things like that. Now, these are genres in the sense that they're unfolding processes as opposed to an artifact. So it's really about how you deal with it within the practice itself. Are you participating in the communication, or are you manipulating it as an object? An example from academic communication would be, say, undertaking a test, writing of an essay in parts, conducting a seminar in stages. So in the same way then, we can plot that as a continuum from non-industry to industry. And we'll get exams at one extreme end. You can't imagine people doing exams, paper exams in the workplace. But on the other hand, you won't really be doing industry operations if you are in a class. However, in between, again, you can have role-playing or mock-up documents. And I suspect that this might be a way to investigate or to analyze what Carl has mentioned earlier in his example of the FBI's investigating aliens, where you have neither the FBI nor the alien present. So in terms of resemblances in RA, then we can ask, does it involve workplace or academic relations and ways of working? So if we put 2 and 2 together, we can have an autonomy plane with a target at one end and a non-target at the other end. And as I mentioned earlier, the non-target here is purely for practical reasons. The target here being assigned because we're adopting the perspective of the authentic assessment scholars. In the right top quadrant, with both PA and RA, you can think of your prototypically authentic kind of assessments in the sense that you can have workplace probations where you're really placed into the workplace itself for a period of time, and industry placement being a little bit further from that. And finally, just doing an industry project such as some of the people's work whom I'm overseeing here, where they just basically pick up a project in relation, with an industry partner. In opposition to that, we can have, In opposition to that, you have the prototypically exotics. For example, a literature review or an essay, a problem set, or decontextualized multiple choice questions. But of course, often in the politicization of authenticity, these are often used as a straw man of sort, where it's simply forgotten that we have a much larger range of possible assessments than that. For example, the interview, questionnaire, or case study could involve the participation of actual people from the industry. It could involve actual artifacts. It could involve actual problems and concepts, right? But except that you don't normally conduct a student interview as part of your job, or a student case study as part of your job. On the other hand, we can also use the other quadrant, where you can conduct a role play, some kind of a software simulation or business report or proposal that is supposedly written for a CEO of a company, but obviously there's never going to be a CEO to read it on the other end. So here you have an activity or a communication that is authentic without involving any constituent. So what's the point of doing this? Well, then that allows us to ask, is there an assessment tool of sorts? Are we setting up an assessment as a step towards the next assessment, as a way to scaffold this experience? Or what I call a dissociation, where you have a set of assessments that are supposed to be in class, where you only assess certain types of skills. And when you place the students in the industry, you get a totally different set of skills that are being assessed. And there's no attempt whatsoever to connect between these two worlds. So in a way to ramp up the semantic gravity of our talk a little bit, I would like to zoom in to a specific dot here known as a case study, where after we ask where does it come from, what exactly is it supposed to resemble, we can next ask the question of, so how does it resemble what it's supposed to resemble? And Andrew will take over from here. Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. So in this section, I'll introduce the Lct dimension of semantics, and then I'll go on and discuss a specific authentic assessment task from a Master of Business course that uses a case study. The dimension of semantics explores practices in terms of semantic structures whose organizing principles are comprised of semantic gravity, degrees of context dependence of meaning, and semantic density, the degree of condensation of meaning. So I'll talk about these two in terms of a specific assessment task, and then I'll link it back to authentic assessment design. So first, I'd just like to recap what Jack mentioned earlier. This idea that realism in authentic assessment has two forms. The presence of a real context that describes and delivers a frame for the problem to be solved. And this realistic context can be present in examinations, written tasks, case studies, problem solving, and short and extensive essay questions. And these act as a proxy for the real world. And also this idea of a task that's similar to real or professional life. And in the literature review, VRL and others write that teachers must know what are the typical tasks and functions that employment demands, and design assessments that are authentic simulations of real professional tasks. So we all read through the literature review together, and I've just reproduced some of the key words here. And we can see that these keywords suggest that realism in authentic assessment involves a strengthening of semantic gravity and some sort of alignment of semantic density. So terms like authentic performance, practical use, ability to solve problems, decision-making, have worth beyond the classroom. So to have use, value, or relevance. So we're seeing links here being made between the immediate classroom context and the so-called real world outside the classroom. And we all read this literature review, and when we came together and compared our notes, we'd all made notes about semantics here, and in particular, the strengthening of semantic gravity. So let's now examine an example of a real assessment task. The first reason for this is that it gives us something clear to focus on. And the second reason is that in 2019, I was asked to design and give some voluntary support tutorials for this course. I'd been approached and told the learners needed help with giving group presentations. And it was suggested that the tutorials could give them some help with their presentation skills. So I used LCT, particularly the dimension of semantics, to understand what was going on and find out what the learners found challenging. And I looked at the course material, the assessments, I attended tutorials and lectures, watched the group presentations, and I also spoke to the course leader. And one of the things I asked him was, well, could you describe to me what is a weak presentation? And he said, weak presentations focus on details of the case in summary form. There's no material relating to the issues of the case drawn from other sources, for example, the textbook. There's little connection between theory and factors raised by the case. No extrapolation of lessons from the case and business and society relationships. And on hearing this, I immediately thought of a low semantic flat line. So then I asked him, well, what does a strong presentation look like? And he said, well, there's identification of critical issues in the case. There's the linkage with case issues and relevant theories. There's a consideration of issues of the case and the wider context of business and society relationships. Longer term implications of the issues are also considered. And I immediately thought, okay, that sounds like a semantic wave. So let's now examine an example assessment task. This was from the course. The learners attend a tutorial, and in the first hour, they're given this question, and they have to prepare a 10-minute presentation in a group. And the question is here. If you were members of the public relations section of Costa, what advice would you provide to managers responding to the Costa Concordia crisis? And here's what the tutors were looking for in the presentations.
Do you just want to remind people, given how many crises we've had since then, what the Costa Concordia crisis was? I remember it, but...
Costa Concordia, yeah, it was this cruise ship. We can see the photo here. The captain of Italy took it too close to an island and caused this terrible accident.
Fabulous. Can I just say, by the way, that you're so engaging that Sam is now fully on board. He's far more interested in semantics, I think. There you go. That's just for all those LCT pet fans out there, that's all.
The strengthening of semantic gravity does it for my dog too, my dog Stanley.
Fast.
So this is what they were looking for, and we can break down, number 3, for example, a bit more, corporate reputation. They had to say that the collision was a threat to corporate reputation. They had to recognize that a poor response from the company could damage stakeholder relationships. They needed to identify that a crisis management plan was required. And then the final thing, they had to come up with the crisis management plan. This was worth the most marks. So what can we say about this task? Well, I mean, it fits the bill as an authentic task. We've got a strengthening of semantic gravity compared with the chapter, the textbook reading, which I'll get to in a moment. It's a real context. There's a real world problem. They're asked to take on professional roles, members of the public relations section. They need to, there's a performative task, they need to come up with a crisis management plan. You know, they also have to give the presentation as well. So strengthening of semantic gravity. And if we now consider semantic density, we've come to think of this here as task complexity. So in order to successfully complete this assessment, there were several things the learners had to do. They had to read the relevant chapter in the course book and understand it. They had to read a separate case study and understand it. They had to provide a comprehensive and concise overview of the case and its key issues, and then link the case to the theory in the reading. They also had to fully participate in the group discussion in the first hour of the tutorial. Then they had to deliver, or one member of the group had to deliver a logically organized, accurate and engaging presentation. So we could see here in this tutorial assessment task, a strengthening of semantic density. And the challenge was not simply about presentation skills and giving a presentation. So let's look at some of these steps more closely. The first one is the textbook reading. And so the corresponding chapter to this is all about the corporation and its stakeholders, stakeholder analysis. And it starts off with a general introduction, talking about this and the basis of stakeholder interests and power in general terms. So the introduction has weaker semantic gravity, stronger semantic density. This is then followed by the key learning objectives of the chapter, listed as points. Again, weaker semantic gravity and stronger semantic density. Then the chapter starts with some information about Amazon. And it says this, I'll quote, "Amazon, which some have called Earth's biggest store, is an important part of many lives. We browse on Amazon, watch on Amazon, and buy on Amazon." And so linking the specific company with the writer and reader's personal experiences. So here we have a strengthening of semantic gravity and a weakening of semantic density. The chapter goes on to provide some business background. I quote, "In 2018, Amazon was the largest internet retailer in the world, measured by both annual revenue and market capitalization." So here we have a weakening of semantic gravity, strengthening of semantic density with these more technical terms, annual revenue, market capitalization. And then the chapter continues with issues that Amazon has had with its stakeholders and illustrates these, and then finishes by saying, "Amazon's experience illustrates the challenges of managing a complex network of stakeholders." And then it goes on to talk about business and society and various theories. So these sorts of issues in more general, more theoretical terms. So a weakening of semantic gravity and strengthening of semantic density. And this pattern is repeated in the chapter. And so over the chapter, we have a semantic wave as it goes backwards and forwards. Thinking now about the separate case study that was unrelated to the chapter, when the learners first read this, they have to understand it on its own terms. So what is the company? What's it producing? What's its service? What are the issues? But then they have to take this information and provide a comprehensive and concise overview of the case and its key issues in the presentation. So we maintain semantic gravity, but there's a strengthening of semantic density. So a shift here from the prosaic code to the worldly code. Finally, let's put the different task components together. And we start off in the top right quadrant with weaker semantic gravity, stronger semantic density. They have to read the chapter. And while the points, the theory is illustrated by cases, the important thing here is the theory, that they understand the theory. Once they've read the chapter and understood it, they then have to read the separate case study and understand that on its own terms, first of all. And then in preparation for the presentation, they have to consider how to provide a comprehensive and concise overview and identify the key issues. So we maintain semantic gravity and strengthen semantic density. And then over the presentation, it's necessary for them to link the case study back to the theory of the chapter. So here we have a weakening of semantic gravity, maintaining semantic density. And then over the talk, and they'll often, what's expected and what the high achieving presenters do is wave between the two, the specifics of the case study and the theory in the chapter. So just to summarize, we can say that this assessment task was an authentic task. It had a real context and a performative task, so stronger semantic gravity. Achievement in the task involved linking theoretical content, so weaker semantic gravity, with the case study, relatively stronger semantic gravity. The low achieving presentations traced a relatively low semantic flat line. So they had stronger semantic gravity, weaker semantic density. They just described the case study. They weren't able to link to the theory. Whereas high achieving presentations traced a series of waves that connect a complex understanding of limited context. So stronger semantic gravity, but also this idea of sort of compressing the case study and increasing semantic density, and then linking that with complex ideas in academic discourse. So stronger students showed knowledge practices that strengthen and weaken context, dependence, and complexity, i.e. they express semantic waves. The role of the voluntary tutorials, well, they were initially to make the semantic waves explicit, make them explicit in the chapter to help the learners with the reading and understanding the content, but also the semantic waves that were expected in the presentations, and to break down the task complexity. So if you like, to weaken semantic density in order to support learners. So this is all very interesting, but what does it have to do with authentic assessment? Well, we can say that assessment tasks can resemble real-world tasks by strengthening semantic gravity. We can make them resemble the real world by strengthening semantic gravity. However, the semantic density in the presentation assessment was different in nature to the semantic density of the real life public relations team. So, you know, they had similar outcomes, while the public relations team also had to produce a crisis management plan. I imagine the knowledge practices would have been different, and the basis for achievement would also have been different. So in this case, you know, the learners had to link it to Lawrence and Webb chapter 1 and show that they'd understood the theory in a way that the actual professionals wouldn't have done. I don't know, but I can't imagine the real life public relations team reaching for their copy of Lawrence and Webb and reading up about stakeholder analysis. So therefore, the semantic density of professional practices are likely to differ from the semantic density of authentic assessment tasks. The authentic assessment is still grounded in educational purposes and practices, and hence the need for terms like authentic simulations and proxy for the real world, etc.
So in case if you guys are wondering, that is the distinction between RA plus, SD plus versus RA minus, SD plus. We'll just let you mull on that for a moment. So here, we'll just very, very quickly run through some of our ideas about what this means for assessment design, work integrated learning, and specialization.
Yeah, so we feel that, I think one of the things that prompted us in this direction was in part our experiences of the last year and our exposure to the frenzied need to solve authentic assessment kinds of problems when the physical workspace became unavailable. So, and suddenly unavailable. So we suspect, the direction we're interested in going in here, I think, is that approaching authenticity by degrees, as I was talking about at the beginning, by essentially calibrating, in this case, autonomy and semantics in such a way that we can get at the idea of authenticity in different ways, can enable us to construct practices and I suppose analyze things that we've done to tease out resemblances to workplace practices rather than necessarily pursuing or being defeated by lack of access to supposedly truly authentic context. So first point.
Sink or swim to scaffolding. So the idea here that greater task authenticity or greater task complexity may lead to this sort of sink or swim. So successful learners in the example who could give a presentation well at the start of the course would continue to do so all throughout the course. Learners who weren't very successful initially were perhaps not successful throughout the whole course as well, or there were sort of incremental improvements. So this sort of approach seems to privilege certain learners above others. And temporary support that allows us to break down the task complexity, perhaps weakening semantic density, may allow for greater understanding and learning, but it might also come at the cost of authenticity. And I think from our discussions, we think that no single approach is intrinsically better, but by understanding the opportunities and limitations of each, we can then make informed decisions.
And that's important because as far as we know, when there isn't a proper way to theorize through this properly, most of the assessments are basically just left to either generics or the academics to decide, they just pick and choose a la carte style, whatever kind of assessment that they prefer personally. So the idea here is if that happens, is the curriculum still going to be coherent? Is there any kind of continuum from the classroom to the workplace, or is there simply a dissociation?
And without a clear understanding of the role of knowledge to make informed decisions, educators are left with a superficial understanding of what is going on, which is something we've come to term shake and bake. So we're suggesting that authenticity is less important than movement across the autonomy plane and the semantic plane. So trips, tours, and waves are more important than how authentic or how complex a task is. And on the left, we can see the instructions for Betty Crocker's shake and pour brownie mix. And on the right, the shake and bake learning model. And we can compare the steps. Step one is sort of preparation, heat oven, complete the weekly readings. Step two, turn container upside down, turn up to lectures. Step three, add half a cup of water, add formative assessment. Step four, shake hard for 45 seconds. This is attend the work placement for fixed period. Step five, pour batter into pan. This is when the learners return to university, and bake for 26 minutes, consolidate learning with final summative assessment. So you can follow these steps, but you won't necessarily end up with work-ready graduates. We're suggesting a deeper understanding of what's going on is required.
Similar implications would apply to work-integrated learning. We can explore using the same tools, the autonomy tours in work-integrated learning, as well as semantic tours in work-integrated learning. And in so doing, we can ask, is there continuity? And by that, we are talking about where assessment items are not just used as a kind of summative assessment to measure how successful the student is in integrating into the workplace, but rather to use each resemblance as a step towards the next. So yes, we are really talking about the teaching learning cycle.
Can I just jump in for a second to encourage people who are, because there's some really interesting comments in the chat. I'm just going to encourage people who raise questions there to just jump in and ask you them, because otherwise, I mean, you can't talk and read the chat at the same time. So please, people, if you're coming up with ideas and suggestions in the chat, we'll send you the chat, by the way, later anyway. For those who are coming up with some really interesting ideas, please just jump in and ask them or mention it to them.
This is really our last slide. So where to from here? After we have looked at autonomy, we have looked at semantics, one next potential step or reasonable step is to look at specialization. When we listen to some of the people discuss authentic assessment, for example, there's a tendency for people to assume that all the knowledge stuff is something that you are doing in the classroom, where a problem set or decontextualized multiple choice question is appropriate. And they basically just leave all the no-worry stuff to for the shake and bake or the sink and swim method, where students are supposed to just simply immerse in the environment and pick it up by themselves somehow. And that constitutes a kind of dissociation in terms of specialization as well. So with that, we would like to welcome any comments or questions. Thanks.
Thank you guys for that. Yeah, oh yeah, well done. Yes, Jagen. Silent clapping. That's the sound of one hand clapping, as we would say in Zen. So please, people just jump in. I mean, like, there's been some really interesting comments. I'm not going to try and parse through them, but just say, like, Jodie and Sharon and Steve and AV and Retha have all been making really great comments, and Andrew Job as well. So I'm inviting you in to say something. You don't just want me to read this stuff out.
Sorry, guys, I'd like to encourage you guys to unmute yourselves and ask us the questions directly, because I'm a little hard of seeing. I can't exactly read the comments on the screen right now.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying as well, yeah.
You're all at a kind of distance from us. There's a big screen up there, which is why we're all kind of looking that way, or I'm looking upwards.
All right, I'll be a little bit brave. Hi, it's Sharon. Thank you, that was so interesting. I'm working with some lecturers and in a law school at the moment on assessment, especially in this pandemic-y online, how do we make our assessment authentic, but make sure students don't cheat, etc., etc. So this is very useful for me, for my thinking. But I was just going back to what, I think it was what you said, Andrew, about you know, students have to kind of reach for the textbook and refer to the textbook, and it's quite an explicit part of assessment. And this is the same in law. You know, there's a lot of theoretical legal knowledge that has to be very explicitly applied when students write case summaries and legal opinions and things like that. But what the lecturers routinely tell you is that, oh, it doesn't work like this in practice. You know, how we teach them the law and how they do the law are completely different things. But, and for a long time, I kind of thought, well, that's ridiculous. Then you should make the teaching more like the practice. But I wonder if the reason that professionals like you were saying, like the professional wouldn't do that. The professional would just kind of reference those principles much more tacitly, maybe. And I was thinking of my work as an academic developer, especially the way I use LCT. And I wonder if the reason I can use LCT without even mentioning the words semantic gravity and semantic density with lecturers, but still use that really powerfully to inform my practice, is because I've come from, you know, the top down. So I started with the theory and then worked out how to apply it to practice. And now I can start at the bottom and kind of wave up much more easily. And if maybe that's a very crucial part of assessment, is to kind of really make the theory very upfront. You have to use the theory and you have to use it in particular ways. And if you do that over a period of time, if that then doesn't make the opposite possible, so that the professionals can just kind of go, oh yeah, of course we're like working with theory. We're just not, you know, explicitly reaching for our textbooks and doing it in this particular way. So we were just having a bit of a conversation about what enables much more theory informed or powerful professional practice might be these very deliberate moves in authentic assessment in the classroom over a period of time. That's all we were saying. So it's a comment more than a question.
Yeah, very interesting. I suppose the way we've been looking at authentic assessment, you know, as part of education, there's this educational imperative, Goffman might call it. There's this evaluation that's part of it. Whereas in the workplace, you know, it's shown in different ways, you know. So even if you go on a work placement and you work in a company, and you the success of that might be in then the piece of work you produce when you're back in the university, the reflective writing or what have you. Whereas if you do it well in the job, when you're working there, you might expect a promotion or a good report or something like that. So the whole basis of it is very different.
You've also prompted me to think about something that I don't think we've really discussed, which is expertise. And it's just interesting, that idea of engagement with knowledge post-educational context. My mind is just immediately going to the music context, because that's home base for me, which within certain subdisciplines of music is characterized by a constant engagement with theory, I suppose, amongst expert practitioners. I mean, high-level practitioners, not necessarily, and not within all subdisciplines necessarily. You know, in some cases through to their dying days. That's what makes the practicing concert musician in some cases, or I'd say practice of the practicing concert musician in some cases. I haven't thought further than that, but it's a really interesting way to think about it, and maybe also useful for us to think about in terms of, in a kind of explicitly, almost militantly practical discipline like music, to think about how we can creatively engage with theory, which may be hard to believe, but sometimes that's a difficult thing to do in a music education context. So thanks for the comment. That's really interesting.
And what you're suggesting there also is really about transparency and explicitness of instruction, isn't it? So if we were to deny direct references to theory, then we may end up with some kind of an immersion model where we're just simply throwing a student into the shake and bake or the sink and swim model. And they'll just have to figure out whether, you know, how they're going to do that. And if they don't have the tools to do that, then basically there's just no scaffolding provided. So really, we have debated to some extent as well, you know, as to if it were truly possible to achieve a truly authentic experience, would that even be desirable, in the sense that there is absolutely no pedagogy built into it at all?
Morning. So I actually wanted to tag on to what Sharon was saying, but I think you've already kind of gotten there in your response. Just about, like, if we think about theory as making the underlying principles that we use in order to make decisions, you know, if the theory is is trying to make those things explicit to students, so that they can then draw on that theory. Then perhaps perhaps you want your assessment practices to look different to kind of what you'd be doing in the workplace at some points. You know, that there's actually a need for stronger theory, because I've seen a lot of papers that talk about in South African context, like the difference that we have. We used to have a distinction between the technikons and the universities, where the technikons were more to teach practical skills, and the university is more for the more academic and theoretical knowledge, and where people say that not giving students access to the theory behind, you know, the practices actually disempowers them, so that they cannot apply that to different contexts, or understand what it, you know, what informs the decision making. So yeah, sorry, I'm a bit rambly, but there you go.
It's like the adage of learn the rules so that you can forget them.
Yeah, and theory that is taught in the classroom allows some degree of verticality that you cannot achieve by immersion alone and in the workplace.
There's been this long, I mean, there's an incredibly long tradition in education of believing that people can learn just by, I mean, as Wittgenstein put it, Wittgenstein would tell his PhD students, I mean, he told most of them to leave academia and go and work in a factory, but he would also tell people that to go and study with someone and just breathe the same air, as if like you could just somehow breathe in, you know, the knowledge and understanding. And I do get that knowery kind of picking up on all sorts of nuanced and inexplicit ideas that does come from immersion and being in contact and so on. I mean, it's the sort of thing that we're always complaining about, you know, the difference between face-to-face and Zoom, and the loss of all those subtle things and signals that we're not seeing. And I know, well, Vincent's getting very excited at this point, if you heard me barking. But you're quite right in the sense of, you know, the need for education. I think I'm just making a kind of tangential point, adding on to what Retha said, which is that the education is possibly about making this stuff explicit, because otherwise you're only going to have the people who already have that who are going to do well. So, I mean, in the project units that we have, the people who are already coded up nicely to be able to do this sort of movements up and down semantic ways, they're all coded up to be able to, you know, select and assemble and enact the kind of right sorts of knowledge. They're going to do really well because nothing is taught to them. Whereas, you know, as Ruth was saying, and other people have said in the chat, education is about making this sort of stuff explicit in order to then sort of, you know, I mean, you make everything explicit, and then, you know, maybe later when you're doing the actual thing, a lot of it is just hidden underneath the surface. You know, that you don't tend to talk theory when you're getting on to do it, you know, when you're actually doing it, but you need it to be able to do it well. So I'll shut up because Karin's also got something she wants to say.
She's very excited. I'm lowering my hand. Good morning, everybody, from a very cold, chilly Cape Town. Oh, this has started my year so well, you guys. I hadn't realized how significant this particular moment would be. Our overarching question at Stellenbosch University, and Jack and I have been kind of working on this on the side, is what forms of assessment enable the kind of learning that empowers engineering graduates? And as you were going through, first of all, you guys, that was a fantastic presentation. There are so many rich moments in it. But I was struck by the mandate. So what's useful in the professions where you have really strict standards in terms of the profession is if you look at the engineering standards, which are globally aligned, etc., they make all those sub-elements of what you were talking about, or what we talk about in education as a whole, really explicit. You have to be able to demonstrate very specific kinds of knowledge, very specific kinds of techniques, very specific, and the knowery stuff is communicate in appropriate ways with appropriate audiences, understand the impact on society, environment, etc. But what Carl was talking about earlier, or just before me, in terms of that tacit thing that happens when you absorb these things by osmosis in the real world, that takes way more time than we have in our short kind of educational training space. And I think that the authentic assessment language, or what you've been talking about, I think there's this conflation of that low flat line. Throw them into a space and this is just going to happen. You know, you'll see it, you'll feel it, you'll engage with it. Our job, and this is to go back to the different spaces on your continuum in terms of both positional and relational autonomy, our job is distinctly different. And we need to maybe unpack this with a different plane or in a different space in order to enable you to move into a different kind of knowledge practice arena. Doesn't mean you teach the practices in that arena. It means you teach or enable the kind of learning that will help you cope there. But it's not the same as teaching you that, because you're going to learn that there over a longer or a different kind of period of time. It's more a comment than anything else. I'm just thinking, I don't know, maybe I'm really excited about what you're going to do if your next step is moving towards specialization, but that we, in our attempts to build this authentic assessment element into our curricula and into our teaching and learning, we're mistaking what its purpose is. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. It's very early.
One of the tensions there, I think, we've talked about this, Karen, I think, is that idea of the pressure to produce the work-ready graduate. That seems, that at least that's my distillation, one of my distillations of what you were just talking about, because that's an interesting question in and of itself. If there's osmosis aspect that is only available
there,
possibly only available outside of our pedagogic context, how does that, what's the interplay there with the requirement to produce that, if that's something that we're...
Something along the line of what you were suggesting there. We considered how knowledge often in the workplace is quite strongly bound, so that what you learn in one workplace context cannot be easily translatable into the next. And what you were referring to in terms of these enabling skills is really about some sort of a method that transcends these boundaries. And that method of transcendence is possibly the function of education, as you are suggesting.
Exactly. That's, Ken, you've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what I'm saying. So it's not this one-to-one dialectical or one-to-one mapping. There's a third space. There's another space. And I do think that the ways in which you've begun to unpack this using the different dimensions is well, we know this is a way for us to understand what that is. But I'm just thinking that if we, for example, were to use your autonomy plane, your breakdown that you originally had in terms of the kinds, what happens in those different quadrants. I'm thinking of Sharon and Steve's work here in terms of taking that tool into that teaching space. I mean, I was interested, have you used it with students yet? Or if one took that into that space as easily as we take the semantic wave or the semantic plane into, let's say, student writing? Or what do you think about that? Taking the autonomy plane with your distinction and differentiation of the kinds of learning we're going to now do and the kind of task we're going to set you deliberately makes you code shift. And this is why. That's a question.
Thanks. That's an excellent suggestion. Yeah, I can see what you're getting at about, operationalizing that as a pedagogical kind of a, thing. And we have not, I have to admit that we have not applied this in pedagogy. This is largely a theoretical paper, but we are certainly keen to take that take it in the direction that you have just recommended there. It's just that at the moment, I think we are still quite a few steps away from being able to do so, simply because even the academics themselves are not really aware of this shift in autonomy. Thanks.
Anybody else got a comment or a question? Or I'd like to ask what you're going to do next.
Set another meeting so we can talk more about it. This has been really useful. My brain's been ticking away while we've been doing this. I think our intention at this point, really, what we're driving towards here is really a theoretical paper that addresses just this aspect of the realism aspect of authentic assessment. Very much in the way that building on the kind of lineage of scholarship that those authors we put up earlier have been working in. Beyond that,
it also can be used as this theoretical paper is meant to be a springboard of some sort that allows us to, apply it to empirical studies.
Yeah, and
very much like what you were suggesting there.
And I think actually that's a good point, because we very much have talked about this kind of through two lenses. One being like a practice-facing lens. I think we ultimately see this project as something that is born of not necessarily our analytical interests alone, but also our interests in actually doing education. And in our context, that means engaging with some of the imperatives. Work integrated learning is really big here at UQ. There are some different avenues to follow, I think, practically, that we're excited about. And so once we've got our tool refined, I think we'll definitely be seeking to take it into the wild, as it were. And
so part of our purpose of presenting this at the roundtable is precisely to solicit some, to bounce ideas of you guys, put it to the test and see if it works.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think what's really interesting is I love the, for anyone who's relatively new, the roundtable is a space for all kinds of papers, from completed projects to preparatory work to trying out analysis on some data and getting people to have a go as well. And it's really interesting to see a kind of paper in which you're kind of mapping out some ideas about how you're going to use different parts of LCT to get at this problem. I mean, one of the things that you'll likely have to deal with, which is of interest to all LCT scholars, is that sometimes you just have to go, I'm going to do one thing at a time. So that, we'll just do this analysis of semantics and have to sort of, force ourselves to not talk about this stuff over here that we'll deal with in another paper or whatever. When you come to write this stuff up, it's often what you don't put in, like music is the space between the notes. It's what you don't put into a paper that kind of makes it readable. So I can see that. I love the way that you are doing multiple dimensions, and I think they're all going to get at something really interesting. And I'm kind of reluctant to suggest this, but I was sitting here writing notes about how important the notion of those three different, the arena, the pedagogic device, or the epistemic pedagogic device, you don't have to get into devices, but the very issue that knowledge is recontextualized already. Practices are recontextualized into a pedagogic space. They're not the same. Nothing is authentic if authentic means the same as workplace, because we change the nature of the DNA of the practices, or at least the structuring of the practices. And it's a case, I think you're suggesting, of whether the codes match or not, rather than the surface element. So I started getting into my notes about, oh, this is interesting. This is a great example. I'm going to want to use your work for an example to write about fields, actually. But I think, you know, it's going to be really interesting to see how you take this forward. And I see there is a kind of program, actually, that you kind of mapped out here of different ways of getting different aspects of this problem.
Yeah, we're definitely inspired in that direction, I think. And it does remain to be seen sort of what we have talked, you know, I think last time we talked about the how much we're biting off in the scope of 6,000 or 8,000 words. But oh, I thought of something else to say and I've just forgotten it. I'll bother. It's gone.
And I guess the application in the business school or in music or in language teaching also gives us sort of lots of scope to see how it's applied, and other sort of, you know, disciplines as well.
And I just remembered what I was thinking.
Oh, good.
I think the other reason, and correct me if my recollection is wrong, the reason we've got autonomy and semantics at the moment, I think, is because it has to do with looking at that idea of realism and trying to figure out. I think one of our initial questions was autonomy or semantics, and then we tried to figure out why, you know, what's the difference between them in this context.
Well, and as we have found out, it's really an interplay of the two of them.
So I think that's how I think, just thinking back on our discussions, I think that's how we ended up with both.
Well, I would suggest this, and I would suggest this to everyone who's interested in LCT, is that more often than not, you find multiple dimensions do come into play. I think if people are new to LCT, I always encourage them to stick with one concept and just work with that for a bit and not try to overdo it. But with yourselves, I would say, you know, you've got the basis here for several papers that you can kind of build a picture of these issues from different angles. You know, that you don't have to do it all in one shot. You know, I mean, that you can sort of say, here's one angle on it, here's another angle on it, and they come together and start to build up that kind of multi-dimensional view of what's going on. That's much more richer than most of the fairly descriptive stuff about what's authentic or not.
Thanks for the comment.
Oh, and the great thing about that is, by the way, is that it makes it more digestible to readers, and you get multiple papers out of it.
Yeah, right.
Well, with that, unless anybody has, because we've gone over our time. That was a fantastic start to the roundtables this year. Paz is going to save that chat for us and send it to you guys as well. Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you to our fantastic LCTQ for doing this roundtable and starting us off in 2021. And thank you all for being here from around the world, and which is fantastic. What a great community. And I can't wait to see you all again in 2 weeks. And we'll be sending out the advertising for that very, very soon. So thank you, you three. I can't wait to hear another one from you in a short period of time, 6, 8, whatever, 9 months time, when you've really gotten your teeth into some of that data with these ideas. It's great.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity to present, and for everyone for coming.
Oh, thanks to everybody. Great. Thanks, everyone. And see you in 2 weeks.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Zoom, I hate Zoom compared to face-to-face for endings, because in a room people can, you know, like clap, and there's a sort of sense of a symbolic ending rather than this kind of, you know, kind of quiet thing, and then everybody vanishes off the screen. Yeah, it's
If you need sound, I can really get into it.
There we go.
Sound. That's right, Jagan. It's all about the sound. We need the kind of physical. There you go. Yeah. It's the sound that's needed. Thanks, Natalie and Henty. But no, thanks, guys. That was great. Really interesting. And I think authentic learning and authentic assessment is going to be really valuable to many people in LCT, but also it's going to bring LCT to quite a big debate out there in words integrated learning and authentic, under a number of different names, by the way, but authentic assessments are just absolutely everywhere. And a lot of the project-based stuff that's now taking over universities is just really pushing this idea of it being so relevant for the workplace. This is going to be just like the workplace. And then I have to teach this stuff in second semester this year, and I've taught it previously. And I can't see I've never had a workplace in which we work like that. Like the project teams that we do in the University of Sydney. I've never been in a workplace that has anything like that. So I don't know what workplace, I mean, you're talking about stuff that's actually much more explicit. There's going to be a lot of, I think, academic experiences out there that this is going to be relevant to that are much more generic. So they'll just say generally, these project-based units are much more authentic to real world tasks and to prepare students for the future. And I look at that and think, how? And it might be that it is the codes. They may genuinely be true of certain industries, but unless we get at these codes like you're trying to do, we won't be able to say what students are going to thrive in, which students are going to thrive in that environment, and also which kind of jobs are they going to go on to. So this idea that it's all jobs, it's only going to be a very small part of the workplace that has a shifting team who come together for a project, do a specific project with, no real background in the area, and then break up and do something else. That's a very minute fraction of the workforce does that.
Yeah, it's interesting. This gave me real grief while I was doing my PhD, actually, when I was trying to figure out authentic assessment in music, because in some of the really early papers on it, you see, I think it's Wiggins from 1989 or something like that. It's a paper on essentially an advocation for authentic skills as opposed to standardized testing. And I think there is even an explicit reference to musical performing, but also sports, I think from memory. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but things like that as disciplines that are already authentic. And the question for us in music then is, well, okay, how do we engage with the requirements? How do we be seen to be engaging appropriately with the inquiry?
And on the other end, when you have institutional pressure to be authentic placed on people like School of Mathematics, that creates a totally different another set of problem.
Yeah. I mean, it's gonna just, this pressure that keeps coming and coming and coming to be relevant to a really ill-defined workplace that is very much a very minute fraction of certain particular areas of finance, for example, and particular city firms. I mean, I think a lot of academics who run institutions, deans and VCs and so on, have no fucking clue what real workplaces are like. And I used to work in Salomon Brothers, the Industrial Bank of Japan International, and on the trading floor of JP Morgan. And I can tell you, none of that has changed since I worked there. And I can tell you, none of that would have been prepared for by doing project-based teaching or whatever it is that's being pushed as being authentic to high-end jobs, in the city. It was nothing. None of that would help because we never did that sort of thing. And yet that's the sort of thing that I know my dean has a very vague sense. We better cut this bit off, by the way, when we put it on YouTube. But my dean has a very vague sense of, or at least puts it across as being very vague sense of, this is going to be so relevant to kids' futures. And no one's ever says, well, what kind of job are you talking about? I mean, so I think my general point here is the thing I said about, I think this work you're doing is going to be really relevant, not just to explicitly authentic assessment that is linked to a very specific place, but also this general push towards forms of pedagogy and forms of assessment and curriculum that are supposedly somehow relevant to the 21st century workplace, not just the kind of things you're looking at, but really across the board. I think it's going to be really relevant. So I think this is great.
I think we've also witnessed the struggle of the group, various groups who have been tasked with implementing things like work integrated learning in our context is one that comes to mind for me, where their remit is huge and they are not enough in number or time or energy to be able to engage with the scope of areas they need to engage with. And so I think we have seen this bit should probably definitely not appear on the recording either. But
Paz, where's Paz? Is Paz still Paz? Mauricio, make a note that we're going to cut it off after the end of the talk and
Don't
get
worry.
rid of all this stuff when we go to YouTube.
I'll cut off the.
We will edit all this shit out. So.
Yep. Don't worry.
But I mean, I think a function of the scenario, this scenario of struggle that they find themselves in, I completely empathize with those groups because their task is impossible much of the time, in part because of the, I think the academic, I don't want to say literacy, but the predilections of the people that they need to engage with, and that's a whole other complex thing. But a byproduct of that is that what does end up being disseminated is sometimes, I certainly have reservations about the impact that it is having.
Yeah. So I'm really encouraging of this work. I think this is really great, and I think it's going to be really relevant to a lot of people. I think it's going to clarify. I think you could sell it really easily as clarifying, in a positive way. I always think positive works best, rather than saying our existing models are rubbish. I always like to say, which is what I think. I always like to say, we've had lots of great work, but what we can do to help clarify it is to start thinking, because it is a muddle as to what authentic means. Most of the time it's used in a way that is one of those, we all know what it means, but none of us define it.
Clarification is really important, I feel, because as I understand it, the pressure comes from up above, where you have policymakers that just come and say, let there be authenticity. And then you have the people taking it up. And eventually it just becomes a politicized kind of a term where, you use it as a measure of I am more authentic than Tao. It's just